All right. If everyone can start getting back to their seats, can everyone hear me? Raise your hand if you can hear me. Great. That was me. That was me. I've been practicing that. All right. Just a PSA. This is great for me because basically my whole dissemination plan is going to be explained in the next 20, 40 minutes. I'll please welcome Ubadah, who's going to be leading this session.
Thank you. Okay, I think I hear my mic, so we're good. It's a pleasure to be the moderator of this session. I think this is the last thing we're doing today. And I'm going to get to introduce our speakers. But before that, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Ubadah Sabbagh. I'm a neuroscientist at the McGovern Institute at MIT. And I'm a neuroscientist. I work in a lab. My work is mainly on engineering viruses so that they can be vehicles that deliver some molecular cargo to different parts of the brain. But other than that, I also am very interested in the system of how we do science and thinking on the enterprise level about the incentive structures we have and the behaviors that we drive. And so it's really a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to this session. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then they'll take it from there. First up, I'm going to introduce Dr. Damon Centola. He's the Ellie Katz Professor of Communication, Sociology, and Engineering at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Network Dynamics Group. He's a recognized and leading expert on social networks and behavior change, highly decorated, many awards, of course, and from the American Sociological Association and many others. He's authored influential books, including recently Change, How to Make Big Things Happen, which captured the attention of a lot of press. His work is considered greatly impactful. And one thing I find pretty fascinating about him is the fact that he has a patent on a method to promote diffusion in online networks, which naively I didn't. I think of patents in biotechnology. I didn't realize that there's many other ideas that can be patented. Next up, I'm going to do the introductions now, and then we'll have our speakers give their talks. It's going to be Dr. Dolores Albarracín. She's the Amy Gutman Penn Integrates Knowledge University professor at Penn as well. And she is known for her work in social psychology, particularly in the areas of social cognition, communication, and behavior change. Dr. Albarracín is a highly accomplished scholar, fellow of multiple prestigious academies, including the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, AAAS, and the Academy of Political and Social Science. She's authored 6 books, literally hundreds of papers, including a wonderful review from a few months ago in Nature Psychology, I think, or Nature Reviews Psychology, on behavioral change interventions, which I really enjoyed reading. And so with that, I'll give it up to Damon, and then after him, Dolores, please.
So this is a pretty exciting group to talk to because we think a lot about this question in our labs and research groups. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is sort of a social change perspective on research culture. And so I'm going to bring examples of other kinds of social change, and I'm going to tie it back to the sort of things we do in our labs and the ways we think about research culture shifting in a sort of science of science perspective over the next couple of years. So the first thing to think about is just change itself. One thing when we look at behavior is that if you look at all these sort of 10,000 fish individually and try to explain them through individual psychology, through their neurobiology, right, through the sort of structure of the fish, you could never individually figure out that when you put them together, they would aggregate to produce a sort of remarkably cohesive collective behavior. And so I think it's pretty similar with people. That if you take a person by themselves and sort of do all this sort of individual analytics, it's very hard to then infer when you put those people into a group of 10,000 together, what's going to come out of it. But what's remarkable is that these kinds of collective phenomena do emerge. And if we want to understand them, what we really need to do is study the patterns of interaction that give rise to these. And then once you understand that, we can understand how to disrupt it and also how to shift it and change it at a population level. And so once you start thinking about population change, you're one of these fish here. Thinking about population change is something we need to understand at sort of the group level. Now, when we do that, of course, we have a lot of science trying to figure out how groups behave. And one of the sort of guiding principles from a structural perspective is the idea that people are connected to people, we influence each other. And these influence networks actually have a pretty distinctive feature, which is that there are some people who are highly connected, and we refer to these people as social stars or hubs. And then people who are sort of less connected, and we refer to them as the periphery. But what you'll notice is not just the number of connections, it's different. It's also the structure of those connections, right? So people who are highly connected have lots of ties going out in different directions to occur to those weak ties, because often they're not clustered, no reinforcement, it's just a tie sort of acquaintances or strangers. Whereas people who are less connected tend to be connecting these sort of little triangles, referred to as clustering and also as strong ties. And what that means is that when we look at a sort of social change process, we think not only about the sort of influence or access a person has, but also about the reinforcement and the sort of influence they're going to have in the network. Now, one of the sort of classic social change theories has been, if you want to initiate a change, you follow the path of the connected person. Now, let's take back to the 1950s, and it was the original club opinion leader. Now, in the social media era, we refer to that as influencer. But the basic intuition is the person who's highly connected. We have a measure called the degree centrality that's what it refers to. And the intuition went like this. If you could just get that person to adopt, then they would turn to diffuse out through a network, and it would sort of spread in contagion fashion from the center to the periphery. What's so interesting about the last 15 years is we have remarkably good data on networks and the diffusion of behavior change, innovation, and sort of social and cultural movements. So from Egypt in 2011, with the Arab Spring, we're able to track the people's interactions on social media networks and how the activism spread through those networks around Egypt. And what you saw was that actually there was sort of some early motivation out in the periphery. And what you might expect is then jump to the center. But what actually happened is it actually cascaded around the periphery. And it wasn't until very late in the diffusion process that the people in the center actually sort of took hold. Now, what you get from this are two radically different pictures of social change. One is starts in the middle and spreads out, which is all of our models from the last 50 years. And then from the last 15 years, all of our data are showing this on the right, which is that it actually grows in the periphery and reaches the middle part at the end. And what's at stake here in terms of understanding what we got wrong and really understanding how social change and cultural change works is fundamentally our intuitions. If you look at these two networks and I said, which of these is going to spread behavior change or innovation or cultural change faster, it's intuitive to look at the one on the left and say, obviously that case, because the person in the middle adopts it and pushes it out to everybody. But what I'm going to show you today is actually the network structure on the right when it comes to social and cultural change. It's a network that spreads change faster, more effectively, and more enduringly. And so why are intuitions wrong? And our intuition is wrong largely because we're using an epidemiological model. We think that behavior change and cultural change is the same thing as COVID-19. It's really not. So diseases spread in this way I'm going to describe as like each link is a possible transmission. But when it comes to social change, and are thinking about the sort of norms that we follow and the practices that we endorse, actually feedback and social context and sort of the structure of reinforcement makes a huge difference in how those processes work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the viral intuition that we have, all of this stuff, and how it's sort of grown and become an influential way of thinking about social change. The core distinction we're going to focus on is thinking of a simple contagion, which is basically a disease, a piece of information, think of a viral video, versus a complex contagion, which is something that requires us to change our thinking, change our routines or our patterns of practice. So it's difficult to change. There's sort of some cost involved. And these two things are qualitatively distinct. Once we surface that, then we'll actually see that some of the myths of diffusion we rely on turn out not to work very well for social change. And then that sort of helps to think about some of the strategies we can use from a interventionist point of view to sort of introduce change in population. So very quickly, I'm going to do sort of a high-level brief view of contagiousness, then get into myth of virality, myth of the influencer, and some of the strategies we use for triggering social tipping points. So contagiousness, if I were to ask what's the difference between the coronavirus and face masks, I think all of us saw something very striking in 2020 and 2021, which was that the disease spread very effectively across national and political and social borders, and face masks didn't, right? So there's qualitatively something there, and that's what's surfaced by these sort of distinctions. So any kind of simple contagion, someone enters the network, they interact with somebody else. You can think of either something like transmissible disease, or you can think of something like gossip. And then the person adopts it and they spread it to other people. And this is sort of our classic model of diffusion. If there is a connection, then there's a transmission. There's a lot of big assumptions that are built into this classic model. One is that contact equals transmission. Also, there's no resistance. And whatever is spreading is sort of easy, low cost. And like I said, it generalizes from the diffusion of actual viruses and contagious diseases to things like gossip, viral radius, and so forth. Now, where complex contagion comes in, and the example of face masks here, particularly in 2020 and 2021, is very useful. If you imagine someone shows up in your neighborhood, they're wearing a face mask. Now, the person in the center notices not only the person wearing a face mask, but everyone else is not, right? And that was a time when, like, you're looking for the social signals from your peers of what you're supposed to do. I don't remember 2020, but, like, no one knew how to get on an elevator or even walk down a sidewalk, right? It was like, what do we do? How do we behave? Norms were like massively disrupted. And so everyone was just looking at everyone else to try to figure it out. And so unlike a disease where when a person shows up, the number of uninfected people don't matter. All that matters is the connection with an infected person. With a norm, all the non-adopters really matter. They're actually countervailing influences preventing the person from adopting. And so now they'll wait for a second source of reinforcement, maybe even a third source of reinforcement, before they feel like there's enough social evidence that this is actually something we're doing, it's legitimate behavior and they'll adopt. And this is true whenever people require some sort of credibility and, most importantly, legitimacy around a new behavior. And so what this means when we think about virality, the classic intuition is that innovations and culture change are like a virus, so that's a myth. And that influencers, people who are highly connected, they're great for spreading diseases, but actually really ineffective for spreading social change. We're going to talk a little bit about an example that comes from one of the interesting historical transformations. This was basically the demographic transition through a lot of countries. The 1960s was, the advent of sterilization and new medication and industrialization, not just food production. And countries that normally had very high levels of infant mortality all of a sudden had very low levels of mortality. And so there was strong, like cultural and even moral norms about having high levels of reproduction in families. 5 to 6 children was normal and expected. And all of a sudden, there were government programs saying you should have 1 to 2 kids. What all of the sort of cultural history reinforced having very large families because of high infant mortality. And so Korea and lots of other nations at that time appreciate there's going to be a massive population explosion and a very, very dangerous not-boosting growth process. And so there was a nationwide effort across all these to try to reduce contraception. Korea stands out. It's very special in this case because Korea achieved, and this is unrivaled, Korea achieved all of its public policy goals nationwide in less than 20 years, which is amazing. You can think of like our war on drugs, which like 50 years later and like billions of dollars later actually got worse. And so achieving that kind of thing is very interesting. What's sort of revealed when we look at the case of Korea and contraception is that the way they did it is actually used local village networks and sort of peer-to-peer relations. And the top-down strategies that other countries have used, like shaming citizens or trying to get financial incentives, none of them work. But these sort of local village networks were incredibly effective at mobilizing nationwide change. And there are a couple of different intuitions we have about the different sort of villages or urban locations where they try to initiate this change. And there were some villages and locations where it's very tightly clustered, and there were just sort of 1 or 2 brokers to communicate across villages. And what you see with that kind of change process is that reinforcement can sort of create adoption within a group, but it doesn't actually spread across groups. You get sort of the adopter group and nothing else. Now, the urban case is actually even worse because there's no reinforcement or sort of social clustering around this change initiative. It's just a couple of people who are dispersed widely. Now, that works great for viruses. That works great for viruses, but actually what happens there is nothing. There is no change process. Now, what happens here with these wide bridge networks, and this is going to be sort of an interesting concept we're going to look at, is instead of having just a connector sort of spread the message or spread the information across the group, there's multiple reinforcing ties across these little clusters and then across villages. And so what happens is you get an adoption process. So now again, you get an adoption process that starts to get sort of reinforcement within this cluster. And then once that cluster is sort of saturated, then it sort of spills over, and then it spills over again. And this spreading process doesn't look viral at all. It's actually this like really sort of structured and deliberate process of going from group to group to group to group. And it's the overlaps between those groups that actually identify how and when these sort of social change processes are successful. And so more generally, this is actually one of the major themes that shows up in organization science and social science more generally is when you have different groups, like basically silos within an organization or different research groups across organizations. One of the major problems is we say, oh, there's innovations in A that aren't being shared with group B or group C. And we want to get rid of silos, we want innovations to be shared. And you can think about this, obviously, in the context of research culture. And so the solution, the big idea from the 1990s in sociology was this idea of the broker. There'd be this person, Robert. And Robert would be the person who was just a social animal. Robert ran around, met Elizabeth, and said, oh, what a good idea you worked on in A. And then you come back, tell everyone in group B, and also tell Emily, so it would spread to group C. And Robert would get lots of praise, adulation, promotions, right, and rewards for doing this kind of thing. And pretty much in business schools between 1990 and 2020, it was, good to be a broker. Like that's what everyone was told. The thing is, this works very effectively for spreading ideas, right? It's very effective for saying, this is what people are doing. But what happens when Group A actually wants to push a normative change in the culture of practice through the organization? Well, there are a couple sort of shortfalls of this design. One is that Robert is well known to be a broker, which means that Emily, when she hears about an idea from Robert, it's not that she doesn't trust Robert as a person, but structurally, Robert's rewards and his payoffs and his advantages come from spreading ideas. So when he comes as an advocate for this new initiative started by Group A, everyone's like, sure, that's what Robert does. He tells us about fun stuff and wants to get us excited about it, but like, we don't know if it's going to work for us. There's a second problem too, which is that people in Robert's Group B don't actually know whether the sort of the new practices that we're adopting in Group A actually work for them. Because we work on a different kind of project, we have different kinds of labs, we have different kinds of norms. It's great that it's working for Group A, it might not work for us. And so one of the interesting things that came about was this idea, the idea of wide bridges, was what if we started adding ties here, not just from Robert, but from other people in Group B to Group A. So now people in Group B can observe people in Group A and their strategy of working, the way they work together, how they coordinate with each other. And then people in Group B can talk about it amongst each other, and then they can coordinate with each other and see how they're going to adapt those work routines to their group. Right? So this is antithetical to the whole concept of the broker, because now Robert loses all of his power. Right? Robert's power comes from his exclusive capacity to broker information across groups. So Robert has lost power in the organization, but the organization or the different research lab now have the capacity to actually learn from each other and transfer knowledge, not just information. Right? So this talks about the sort of architecture, and what's so interesting, this is something I'd sort of elaborate on in the book, what's so interesting is this architecture shows up again and again and again. Right? Sometimes it was deliberately designed, sometimes it happened accidentally, but every time we see sort of large-scale change emerging and sort of spreading across diverse groups, it's always because wide bridges are forming across these groups and allowing sort of knowledge transfer, not just information transfer. The Human Genome Project is just a case study in the building of wide bridges. So it's really, there's this treasure trove of data. You can actually go through and read all of the meetings, of all of the minutes, of all of the centers for the entire Human Genome Project, which I spent a while doing. And if you're not writing a book on this, it's not very interesting, but if you are writing a book on it, it's fascinating. You can actually see how intelligently they actually would bring people from different labs. These are labs who are competing with each other, remember. And they would bring people from different labs in and they would go on tours and they would talk about, because all the protocols are different, all the designs are different, the measurement tools, like everything. And they're actually trying to work on this process of coordination. And what they did was actually build this sequence of wide bridges, which allowed the project to succeed. You see this same exact thing happening in Silicon Valley. Yep.
What happened in
we mapped the human genome.
The translation of norms. What is the norm that probably need?
Oh, research protocols, like what kinds of pipettes we use, what kinds of design we use. A lot of it was a kind of computer science project of what kinds of problem are we solving at what level, what's the level of aggregation, how do we put these pieces together to solve a puzzle, and if one lab's using a different strategy for putting the pieces together, then when they finally aggregate them, these two things don't make sense to one another, right? They're incommensurable. And so scientifically, you need different scientific communities. Remember, part of that incommensurability could be an advantage, right? Everyone's shooting for a Nobel Prize in these groups, right? So they actually want to do things slightly differently. That distinctiveness is important. But in terms of coordinating across groups and doing a collective effort, they actually had to reinvent their logic of how to share knowledge with other groups because they weren't just sharing knowledge, they were coordinating. Silicon Valley, there are lots of famous cases. And then even the field of network science, how it grew up, is really interesting, where you saw like 20, actually probably 40 years ago, people started having cognitive science grow up this field, and they started having cross-disciplinary appointments, where like you'd have someone in philosophy who was appointed to, neuroscience, which was really weird. And it was like the individual broker model. You had those sort of exceptional academics who would be appointed. But as you can see now, Dolores and I and everyone else has like 16 faculty appointments across schools, and that's part of this logic of like building wider bridges and more reinforcement. And even the story of Black Lives Matter, I think fascinatingly also has this sort of logic of wide bridges. When we saw in 2013 and 2014, nothing happened, and it grew, and then all of a sudden there was this explosion. What happened in the meantime was that these social media networks were forming wider and wider bridges between communities. So what that does when we sort of start to downplay the broker is it actually sort of refocuses our attention in terms of like how an individual person versus the structure of the network governs this sort of change process. So when we talk about this person highly connected here, we think of that person as playing sort of a seminal role. And what's interesting is when we think about sort of disease or inflammation, a simple contagion, that logic holds, where that person sort of can become infected or activated with one idea and then spread it to everyone else. But the thing is, when it comes to social change, just a point I brought up earlier, all of these ties aren't just outgoing ties, these are incoming ties. A highly connected person is a highly observed person. And a highly observed person doesn't become that way unless they are really aware of how they're perceived, right? So this is someone who's incredibly aware of how they're seen, which means when it comes to a change process, they're looking around to see whether or not other people are doing the same thing. over here in this kind of network, these people are less connected. And moreover, they're with people who are sort of part of the same reinforcing cluster they're in. So it only takes a couple of people to reinforce an idea for it to take hold and spread. And so what that means is that once you have these sort of countervailing influences playing a role, that once you understand that and look back in sort of the data and history of change process, almost always you see when the change process was something that was well known, well understood, and already sort of approved of, then yeah, highly connected people played a role. Whenever the change process was changing institutional norms or shifting culture and beliefs, it always started out in the periphery and grew to the center. And so that helps to distinguish how simple and complex play a role in these change processes. Now, in terms of what we sort of learned from that and how we applied it, if you have a network like this, and one of the intuitions is, sure, it's hard to activate people who are highly connected, but let's just say we could. Let's say we can incentivize them, put them in a room, we should brainwash them, or we just give them lots of money. Whatever it is, we get that person activated. Wouldn't that just solve our problem? And this is what that model looks like. It's just massive spread from one person to everyone else they're connected to. And this is the viral model that everyone gets so excited about. The problem with the viral model, it's not just that it doesn't work for complex engagements, it's that it backfires. If you try to use this model with a social or cultural norm, things actually get much worse. And the company who learned about that fact was Google, right? When they tried to initiate Google Glass, they tried the influencer model, they get highly connected tech people who adopt it. And what happened is, some people know, this glass technology was like this cyborg, view and surveil the environment. And it was such an offense to the sort of community in the San Francisco area, not only that people would sort of browse the web when they were talking, but that they were being recorded without knowing it. It's such a violation of social norms that the term glass hole was invented for someone who would wear glasses. And signs were put up in cafes and restaurants, glass hole is not welcome. And so the people who were supposed to be the elites or pioneering the sort of diffusion process actually became social pariahs. And it actually helped them sort of manufacture a culture war in San Francisco. And so this not only sort of wound up with the sort of withdrawal of that product and the sort of shutdown of the line, it actually hurt Google's reputation as a company. Right, so the backfire effect here is it's sort of salted the earth for Google's future attempts to wearables. And so that's a really important thing to take into account. And it's if we have a network here where we sort of take into account norms, the influencer may get like one or two people off the ground, but it's really not going to initiate change. But this is the most fascinating thing about the science of complex contagion, once we understand how diffusion works. You can take the same network with the same level of resistance where the influencer was ineffective, and if you just target a different part of the network out in the periphery, you get a really different sort of change process. What winds up happening is it sort of grows, and it doesn't just spread to the center. It's not viral. It actually fills in these wide bridges and cascades around the structure of the network until it builds a critical mass. And then once it gets a critical mass, then it grows through the rest of the population. And so this is a qualitatively sort of different change process than what we see with viral diffusion. So some of the lessons and the sort of intuitions that come from this. First of all, when we're thinking about change, we have to focus on like, why do people resist it? They're fundamentally looking for credibility and legitimacy, and these are social phenomena. And then the peers who are going to influence them are most effective, this concept of relevance. And then when we're really trying to change behavior, almost always we're actually trying to change norms. We're trying to change norms, it means that the countervailing influence, the people who aren't adopting, who are seemingly invisible to change process, are actually playing a huge role in people's decision making when they adopt. Do I have a minute to do tipping points, or should I stop here in a minute? Okay. So what this means when we carry this over to thinking about the big picture of tipping points, is that largely what a tipping point is a shift in the coordination process. There's a norm established, all kind of coordinating with each other, and there's a tipping point who's trying to push the population. And the classic intuition from economics is, well, you need 51%, right? You need a majority to push the population over. And the sort of really sort of special intuition that comes from this tipping point literature, which was first actually pioneered looking at in gender studies, looking at the role of women in organizations, how do it change norms of sexual harassment and wage inequality. And they found that like actually it only took about 25% of the population of women sort of co-organize around these sort of change initiatives, and they could shift the culture of an organization. I found this in politics too. And we started sort of thinking about it more broadly, sort of change models and how they work. And it turns out for all kinds of social change, for support for marriage equality, and even the growth of technologies like Twitter, what you typically see is this growth curve that looks like this. And what most people are wondering about is like, how do you get to here, right? This is the sort of elbow in the curve where you get sort of acceleration and change. And one thing that I think, one of the sort of greatest violences that social science did to this area of social change was that someone came along and just started labeling these parts of the curve post-hoc, right, after the fact, and saying, Well, sort of by default, the people who adopted here are the early, let's just call them the early adopters. The people who adopt here, let's call them the regular folk. The people who adopt here, let's call them the laggards. These are not empirically derived categories. These are just post hoc descriptions. So the intuition that's created is these are different people. Actually, these are just different parts of a curve. We don't know if these are different people or not. There's like a group of people who are the early adopters, there's a people who are the laggards. In fact, from a structural perspective, I think what you're seeing is that this is the part of the curve that's growing the critical mass. And once that critical mass is hit, it doesn't matter who the person is, it's actually part of the network they're in. It accelerates this kind of at the end. So this is exactly what I showed you before. You see this process spreading. What's happening here is this is the slow part of the growth curve, right? It's growing through a structured periphery, through these wide bridges. And then as soon as the critical mass is hit, that's when this whole process starts to really accelerate through the center, and that's where you see that sort of radical acceleration, and then it reaches out towards the periphery. So including the intuitions here really guide our understanding of networks. And although we all have strong intuitions that works fast, I hope that once you start to think about countervailing influences in complexity and adoption, you start to see how these kinds of networks peripherally really help us, and that gives us new intuitions. We start to think about what they do in dimensions of change. The book is there. Also in the research groups, as you would imagine, I'm a big fan of all the sort of methods you start thinking about, all the sort of ways we're trying to make science more transparent, all the data analyses, scripts, and everything from our research on that site. So it's a good explore it. Thanks very much. Oops. Yeah. Not sure I like this.
All right. Well, wonderful to see what Damon has been up to. And I'm going to let me turn off this. There. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to be sharing with you some of our recent work that's actually very practical and allows you to reach a lot of conclusions on what we should be doing to change behavior in general. And for this audience, I thought I would just give you a glimpse of what most of the theories about how we change behavior, especially the ones that have been implemented into behavioral change programs in various domains, especially health, which happens to be one that's very frequently studied, what these theories have done. And great, and how we started with those to make progress into some other domains. So classic theories of behavioral change, one is the reasoned action approach, social cognitive theory by Bandura, the information, motivation, behavioral skills model by Fisher and Fisher. So what these theories do, one of them, for instance, the IMB, information, motivation, behavioral skills model, is to look at this situation of predicting and then changing behavior on the individual level by tapping information, motivation, and behavioral skills, which are, combined in some fashion. So for instance, you can measure knowledge and try to predict behavior from it. If the behavior is really simple, like where is the ballroom, and they tell me where I can have all the skills I need, so that's a direct impact on behavior. I can just do it. Other times, once I acquire some basic information, I need a set of routines, skills, processes, learning how to get help, and so on. in which case you actually absolutely need the skills before you can execute the behavior, very much the kinds of problems you're looking at here. And then, of course, in virtually every case, you need some degree of motivation to execute the behavior. The motivation can trigger skill acquisition and so on. Other related models that have been actually the basis for that would present a similar situation, looking at attitudes, which is the judgment of whether something is good or bad, norms, what others want from you or what they themselves do, and my perceptions that the behavior is actually easy, I can control it. And I bring this up because this would be one of the individual models that actually says, and by the way, there are structural factors here which might have an influence on everything else. And this also means that the only way through which structural factors, be that, the presence of a pre-registration site or SES having health insurance, the only way in which they can impact behaviors by going through these individual level factors. So they would trigger something like, if I observe that there is this website that I can use, I'm going to develop an attitude towards using the website, and that's going to eventually change behavior. So what's missing from those kinds of models is, well, first of all, environmental factors we know have other impacts. So they can have fairly direct impacts on what we do. They constrain behavior in various ways. We don't have an estimation of the efficacy of actually tapping these different components, and this is absolutely key. And we sort of lack a structure to classify and make decisions about different interventions that we could actually use to impact these different components. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is probably, I'm sure, the case or for anybody who studies something about changing behavior, changing attitudes, one of the most revealing and frustrating periods at the same time and exciting in other ways. I spent a lot of hours trying to convince agencies that opening up a misinformation fighting unit wasn't going to get people vaccinated. And they wouldn't believe it. Often they said, well, how do you know this? Well, because I've been studying various health behaviors, and it's never been that way. It doesn't really have any impact. Yeah, but we think that in this case, it does. So I spent time with the data to say, well, the next time we'll have the actual data on what happens across all behaviors. So what we did was we reviewed meta-analyses of behavioral change determinants, I'm not going to talk about it, and interventions. And then we classify them into those that address individual factors and those that actually tap the environment, which involve things like knowledge, beliefs we define as the probability judgment. If I think that something will have an outcome, that's a belief. The general skills such as planning, I might think, well, if I'm a good planner, I will plan all my research really well, and that's all I need. General attitudes, I might admire open science and think, well, if I create sufficient admiration, that's going to achieve it. Emotions, I might fear retractions. Behavioral skills, creating the routines and the kinds of things you're doing here. Or can I actually develop a habit? Can I ensure that I'm going to automate the routine in response to a cue? And then on the social structural end, we sort of created this sort of division into laws and regulations, administrative procedures and sanctions, institutional trustworthiness, And there is injunctive and descriptive norms. Injunctive norms are typically defined as what others approve of, descriptive as what others actually do, reminders, incentives, social support, and access. So with that in mind, we were able to simply obtain what I'm going to show you is not a meta-analysis actually, because Nature reviews doesn't accept them. So it had to be something else. So we did simply a mean and the range of effect sizes that we found. These are all odds ratios. So you can see, there is the negligible area. There are some that are small, like between 1.44 and 2.48 would be a small effect size, which is a correlation of 0.1, Pearson metric, not very large. Then you have medium and large. And as you can see here, there's a heck of a lot of nothing in a lot of areas, a lot of negligible effects. But we have some regions in which we're seeing sort of small, medium, and large. So we wanted to display this. This is across all behaviors. So any behavior that had been tested with a randomized controlled trial and meta-analyzed made it in. And you can again see negligible effects on top. You have small effects here and there, medium effects, and only one large effect, which is improving access. If you give people health insurance, like the Affordable Care Act, that will get you a lot of behavioral change. So how do you actually do? What's in there? What do they look like, these kinds of programs? Well, I will get to that in a minute, but one implication is that there's this whole area on top that we probably shouldn't be spending a lot of time on, and that involves imparting information, which is often the most intuitive route, changing beliefs, general skills such as, the ability to plan. Yeah, it makes sense, of course, but if you didn't develop that in kindergarten, you don't have a lot of hope to achieve it in the PhD program, yeah? So there are different reasons why some things are better investments, but these happen to not be very good ones to change specific behaviors. And administrative and legal sanctions, which also have negligible effects. So what should we do then? Well, we can do any of these things. At the individual level, I would say certain emotions, if you have something that's going to induce guilt, pride, fear, that's going to get you a small effect. Behavioral skills training, another small effect, knowing how to execute the behavior that you actually want to impart, how to access resources, how to obtain help, behavioral attitudes, which are formed basically by learning about the positive behavior outcomes of what you're proposing and all the undesirable outcomes that you're going to prevent if you implement your next practice. And if you manage to create habits, that's fantastic. Of course, that's, it's very hard to create habits if you cannot create behavior to begin. But if you can, that's absolutely the way to go. It will get you a medium-sized effect. Then on the social structural side, you again have a lot of small effects. Norms have small effects. Monitors and reminders as do incentives. So for instance, injunctive norms, you would normally intervene by discussing the expectations of others, surveys about what people approve of. Maybe your little annual evaluation would mention open science. and how others appreciate it and so on. And descriptive norms are typically, intervened on through things like a comparative chart, like in Cialdini's work, or the type that you get from your power company when they show how much energy you're consuming relative to your neighbors. Then incentives would be small, and social support actually is a medium-sized effect. So we're getting into a region that deserves a lot of attention, and of course, access. And in your domain, access will be all the wonderful sites and forms of actually implementing the practices that you want. So the argument based on this and all that we know would be for a multi-level intervention to change these behaviors, and the disciplinary, institutional, group, and individual level. And these kinds of interventions achieve several of these things: targeting skills, behavioral attitudes, habits, norms, reminders, monitors, social support, and access. Once you have done this, you're going to see some outcomes. And I think that's a part that we often forget. So you implement the intervention, you see some outcomes, and some will be the outcomes like, okay, how many papers are pre-registering? I'm a social psychologist, not only a psychologist. So that's one of the fields in which we sort of invented open science. So you're going to see outcomes like now 90% of our experiments that we publish are probably pre-registered. So you'll have the rigor outcomes, but what I think we cannot forget about is that there's going to be other outcomes. And some of these I've seen just training grad students and seeing what's happened within my field. There are some potential outcomes for discovery, social outcomes. So for instance, if you train just in open science, I've seen entire generations of psychologists, I'm almost done, entire cohorts who went in and said, well, I'm going to apply open science. Well, you still need to do good science, because if you don't, you get no results. So they say, okay, every experiment I ever tried in grad school and beyond failed. Of course, that's not the result we want, but it is a very frequent result, because getting good results takes a different set of skills. It's not only I'm going to pre-register and hence the study works. And this is what I think this kind of community would be amazing for, if you can do both, so that they can do rigorous, but also some of it has to work, or we will have no funding for science, right? We need some social outcome out of this, not only rigor. And I see that as a challenge, just as I'm sure all of you do in training grad students. The kinds of things that make experiments fail are hard to imagine what a grad student in their second year of the PhD program might actually do with an experiment. But how do you train comprehensively to achieve both goals? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Discussion and Q&A section of this. Before we do that, in my excitement for the talks, I forgot to mention two important items. Actually, one important item and then one less important. The important item is, why is this relevant? Hopefully is a little bit intuitive to us, but basically this entire project is, to me, I don't know how the funding, 25 million plus intervention experiment. And so it's important that after we think about that, what comes after the content that the meters are developing, how are we going to disseminate this? How are we going to measure short-term and long-term adoption and impact and things like that? The less important item is why I'm here. I'm on the advisory committee of Community for Rigor, and I forgot to say that. Where you lost Damon? Huh.
Right. My fault. And it's like picking up just first time. Go. Very stressed. Okay, everything went fine. Great.
Welcome back. Are we all mic'd up? Yes.
Oh,
You lost yours? I can give you
yours off. Yeah.
This is wireless.
Thanks, Steve. Heck yeah. Sure.
So I have my own questions, but I want to start by opening up the floor to the audience. Wonderful. Do we have somebody running a microphone? Okay.
The first.
Oh, actually, forgive me, your name escapes me. April, raise your hand first.
Hello.
Thanks so much. These are so interesting. So one of the struggles I have is like what we're really trying to do is create more scientific thinking. Like that's like the real goal is something that's invisible. Like what's going on in your head as a scientist is invisible. And the things we can measure that are visible to other people are actually kind of proxies for what we really are doing, which is like, you know, we want scientists to be able to like really know how to think scientifically about their work. And they'll signal it through pre-registration and they'll signal it through like sample size stuff. There's like, these are all checklist things, but it's not the actual change that we really want. So can you think of other examples where something invisible, like a behavior change that is internal, is like, how does that, what does that mean in these sorts of like approaches to behavior change?
Go for it.
I mean, is that?
You're good.
Okay, is that right? The way I think about it is in terms of like when they're designing their research projects and they're sort of coming to you with designs. One thing I've experienced in the sort of rigor space is that when I talk about doing sort of population level studies to look at how structure affects outcomes, most of our methods are designed for individual level analyses. So for instance, in some of our experiments, we have like 100 or 200 people in a network. Now the question is, when you finish that study, how many data points do you have? And by my lights, you have one data point. You have the network, right? And so if your manipulation is a structural variable, like the sort of topology of the network, you need to replicate it at the network level, right? And so what winds up happening is with 8 replications, 1,600 people, it's actually only 8 data points, right? And so one thing you get back from reviewers is something like, you don't really need to be this rigorous, right? You can just do multi-level analysis. You can like, cluster errors at the group level. And so it's interesting that, when we're handling those and I'm sort of teaching the grad students how to think, it's, look, it's okay that they think we're doing something we don't need to do, because our expectations are we're making structural hypotheses and it's the proper way of doing it. Where that shows up in their thinking is when they start to propose designs, right? And this is something that takes, as you know, like over the first couple of years, they propose a design, you work on it, propose it, you work on it. You start to see a shift in whatever they're learning in stats classes to, okay, theoretically, this is actually what should be done. Do we have the methods to do it? Maybe we don't. So let's think about whether or not we can build a method that's going to solve that problem. And I think that's where you start to see really in like the creativity and originality of like them coming to their problem. You start to see this shift from like students early on kind of saying, what's available, what can I use, to what's the right way to solve this problem? And then what can I make? And I think that kind of invisible shift is something I look for in terms of them taking accountability and responsibility for like the scientific method. Because so much of what we're doing, especially social science at the frontier, it's like the methods never existed. Doing large scale experiments on populations just was a dream for like 80 years. People talked about the possibility of it. Now we can do it, but then you have to develop new methods of sort of analysis to make that sort of, those sorts of causal conclusions hold up. Anyway, so I think that generalizes to a lot of different kinds of areas where you see that sort of originality showing up. And I also think that pre-registration, I express this to Kara. I don't know if you want me to say this or not, but I have concerns about pre-registration. I don't think it's a great idea. And it's very much like what you said. It's a series of checkboxes. It's teaching people that like if you just do these things, then you're doing good science. It's absolutely untrue, right? And pre-registration, just like everything else, can be gained. There's ways of getting around it. Instead of teaching people to think properly about the right way of doing their study to get rigorous results that are internally satisfying. You say, I believe what I found. It's if you check all these boxes, reviewers will like it and you'll get through. And I just think from a sort of orientation perspective, it's the wrong orientation.
I think what you're getting at is that some of these are internal processes, psychological thinking process, essentially. Some others are overt, yeah. So for the ones that are internal, you could probably think aloud protocols to actually see how do good scientists think through a problem, because this is, I mean, first it's implicit, then it's not algorithmic, yeah. It's just you're getting ideas. It's not like you have a method and go through a checklist, but and there might be some benefit. But other things are actual behaviors. Yeah, if students don't tell you that they selected the method because they saw that something was working, even though it is working due to a confound, that's a pretty concrete behavior that you can try to change, yeah, and through all these different ways. So I think there are two parts to it.
As our materials mature, we have a concrete problem, and I want to like really push you all on this. The concrete problem is the following: like when we have the materials, there's different ways for us to put out the materials, and let me first briefly review how I view the network structure of science. Maybe we disagree about this, but you can say the labs have very strong affinity within it. Like most people within most labs kind of talk with their lab mates, like relatively regularly. And then there's like weaker links within universities, like, but even the labs that are right next to me, I might talk with them like every 2 weeks or so. And then there's like people that are in a different building and I might only like talk with them once a year or something like that. So there is like this weird structure of like small groups that are strongly connected. And then let's say classmates might be strongly connected. Now, here's our concrete decision problem. We have the materials. We can now push in ways that hit like one of these local clusters you were talking about, Damon. Now, like we can do the lab meeting thing. The lab meeting thing hits everyone in the same lab. And therefore, arguably, like produces like lots of like local red dots, if we talk about your model there. We can push into the university classes, but there we will get individual people in a lot of labs with like very low degrees of connectivity. Alternatively, arguably much cheaper, we can hit like Twitter with our outreach, and that produces very distributed individual local red points. The problem is that kind of the things that don't get them outside of the lab meeting unit, the things that don't hit them localized tend to be cheaper. Like it's like much easier to get the word out on Twitter than to go into a university and really negotiate that lots of like labs in the same university take our materials. So I was hoping you can give us some guidance on how to navigate those trade-offs.
If I could just layer on top of Conrad's question, I'm curious from your perspective what periphery is in the academic network and what the center is, because that would be also like useful for framing this.
There's two thoughts I have, and it's a great question. It's one that we all face. So there is a distinction that's typically made between sort of what's called big science, right? And with some labs, you have like people at my stage don't even do science anymore, right? We write grants and we just sort of supervise. And these tend to be right. And so what winds up happening is you get a very centralized system where the lab model is based on this sort of, there's some interaction among groups. So basically everyone's following toward the director's lead versus labs that are flatter, right? Where like there's lots of sort of interaction among different people and there's sort of co-creation of research projects as opposed to top-down direction. This is what the grant says, the team is going to execute. And you see this difference across sciences, right? Biology tends to look one way. And social science tends to look another. One thing social science has been going through for the last 20 years is like figuring out what is our lab model. Because people started imitating biology and physics. And they were like, maybe actually this isn't, like our science isn't mature enough to just do bench science, with like 50 people executing. Maybe we actually need to have more conversations and discovery. So that kind of flatter model versus the more centralized model, which is a scale issue. Larger labs tend to be more centralized, smaller labs tend to be flatter. And that actually affects these questions about what kind of discoveries are made. The most recent science, I think, says the larger labs tend to perform admirably at incremental research, right? But when it comes to sort of paradigm shifting research that kind of changes how people think, it tends to come from the smaller labs, right? This is like one of the main results. Now, when you talk about how labs interact with other labs, one of the interesting questions is, well, what do? Do you set up lab meetings to create bridges where like other labs come? This is what we've done. We have other labs come in and they show up, and you already know what's going to happen at the end of the story. Other labs come in, they show up, they talk about their research, and then during the same semester we go to them and we talk about our research. And what happens? You go back to your lab and everyone's like, why are they doing that way? It doesn't make any sense at all, right? And so it's interesting to get the sharing, but it doesn't actually build a bridge. One thing we've done that I think has been effective is that we have so many different, we have like 18 different labs in Annenberg. We have like lots of different research groups. And so grad students have multiple memberships. And so grad students with multiple memberships wind up being the wide bridges. They come over to this lab meeting, they're also part of that lab meeting, and multiple students are going back and forth. And they're saying, well, this is a really cool project here, and we can talk about it in the context of the project going on here. And they're actually this sort of bridging mechanism between each of the lab groups within Annenberg. And it's harder at the university level because there's different orientations, but
maybe tie it a little bit more to what we concretely do. There's two kinds of products that we're putting out. One product is a 45-minute thing that a lab is supposed to take together. Think about like typical experimental lab, 10 people there, they sit together, they go through that material as a group. Product 2 is a 3-hour long, you go at, like by default, you go at home, you go to a place, you get your 3-hour training. The question is, how should we prioritize these two products internally within our group?
I think there's the difference. What's the difference?
Okay, so the first product is taken by a group of 10 people, one lab, together in one room.
Sure.
The second product is something that basically is offered to anyone who wants it.
Oh,
it's like a 3-hour
like a training.
How shouldn't your way of thinking about tell us how we should prioritize those two products?
Well, it depends what you're trying to achieve, and I'm interested in hearing what Dolores has to say about that too. If your goal is to shift lab norms, so
yes, that is definitely the goal.
My belief is that having people go individually and experience trainings is not going to change much at all. Is that so our lab meetings are like 4 or 5 hours long, so everyone's sitting in the room for that whole time exchanging ideas. And one of the sort of motivating principles of the research group I built was we have people in there who are really policy oriented and people in there who are basic theorists just doing math. And the idea of having everyone in the room for 4 hours is that the math projects aren't really worried about policy, but the policy person in the room or the people in the room who care about that say, how are you going to apply this, or what would that mean in this particular context? And so it pushes the conversation and the discussion away from pure math into, yeah, I have to worry about that problem too. And ditto for the policy people when the math person says, well, actually, would that generalize to these other contexts, the ones you're not thinking about? And that becomes part of their project. And I see that kind of reciprocity and that sort of exchange as something that establishes kind of a norm of how we think about problems and makes students sort of more flexible in their thinking. Dolores, before we... Yeah, Dolores.
Yes, on that issue, typically something done by a group can create more resources, but it depends on what they are doing. If it's just content, it's probably not going to be very effective. What could be effective is going through the problems individual lab members have, and the experience, and that can be communicated somewhat, but especially experience, that if you do things in this rigorous way, you're going to get to more better information down the line. Like that will really lead to a robust discovery that's going to make you famous. Because if that part is lost, I think, we just do boring things in a rigorous way that lead to very, very exact null results. I mean, that's not exciting,
I think that's all I had.
Yeah, I have the mic, so I'm going to ask the next question. No, I had my hand up. I think this question is mainly directed to Dolores, but I'll try to formulate it a little more broadly. I tend to think of the issue, it's kind of parallel to your environmental versus individual, but I think of it more as bottom up versus top down. And, you know, what this community is about is more the bottom up things, education and spreading ideas through community. In the top down, I'm thinking of the incentive structure in science. And you obviously had that category under environmental factors, but you had it as a category. And of course, incentives can be weaker, stronger, more or less effective, depending on the context. And I would argue that in the case of science and rigor, the incentive structure is negative and almost overwhelming. It's existential, right? You don't get grants, you don't publish papers, you don't get tenure, you don't keep doing science. It's as simple as that, right? So I guess I'm just wondering how you would think of it, that level of incentive or, you know, structural incentives in terms of shaping individual behavior in the context of your non-meta analysis of the role of incentives.
And the assumption there is that because there are these incentives that incentivizes bad behavior, or
Yeah,
good
that's the
bad
assumption.
behavior?
That as long as you have thousands of small labs under enormous pressure to publish positive results, you'll get a lot of false
I
positive
tend
results.
to think that's because they also don't, you know, there is a lack of skill in how to produce results, yeah? And when to move away from an area of research that's not gonna go anywhere. I mean, all these decisions, I think, are part of it. If you could actually create how to do that well, nobody wants to fake data, yeah? Students fake data when they have nothing to show. So it's all the previous steps leading to it show not only the incentives, I would say.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really talking about faking data. I'm talking about sort of faking significance, which is what the way I conceive of p-hacking.
Yeah, it's the same.
And I guess, but I guess my question is when you, so you can have positive bottom-up factors, but when you have very strong negative top-down, and we can argue about how negative those top-down factors really are. I think they're, but I guess I'm just, in the context of your research, you seem to think that incentives did not have a big effect on changing behavior. And that doesn't jibe with what I see in this, but again, not all incentives are equal. And that's sort of what I'm asking. In this case, we have sort of existential incentives to publish false positive research.
Absolutely. I mean, these are interventions that use incentives. They do not give you an R01, yeah? They give you $200. That's it.
Yeah. But
so that's a skill. Absolutely, yes. So I don't know how to fix that, but my intuition is that that's not going anywhere. I mean, the federal government cannot fund grants that lead to rigorous but null results, you know, across the board. So somehow you need to teach to get it right in an honest way. And I think there are ways of doing that, but it's not simple. I agree. But I think that's the key issue here. And besides, you know, yeah, we have the incentives, but I don't think we can change the incentives and create all these journals of the things that failed that are properly reported. Yeah, that's my intuition, at least, about that.
Thanks very much.
Just wanted to say, am I on? I just want to say the federal government can if it wanted to, but that's a different conversation. Good science good science, if it's null, it's still good science, but that's a different question for the NIH.
I mean, what I would say to this is that, you know, there are different kinds of incentives, right? So, and we are talking across various different sciences, right? And so they're organized differently. I think one of the special things, so I'd come out of this weird joint program between sociology and physics, right, that Cornell did. And so we read a lot of physics papers and saw they did science, and then read a lot of sociology papers and were really confused about why they were calling it science. And so there was this sort of there was this sort of back and forth. And so there was this question of like, what is the right model for doing science in sociology? Because you'd read a bunch of papers with models and no data. And every single paper you read in Science and Nature in the physics program, like every paper had a model and data. And so this was like this question of how to do sociology properly. But what's interesting on the job market, which is also very different in different fields, right? Some fields you're expected to get a PhD and then do 3 postdocs and then get established and have your grant, and then that's how you get a job. But one of the sort of lucky things about social science, it still kind of has this sort of humanities model where you come out and you're supposed to come out as this sort of whole thinker burst into the world, and you've got this big new idea and you get a job. And so that's actually kind of a luxury when it comes to rigor, in the sense that there's a sense when you're birthing this big idea that you're accountable for it. And you can't just say, well, other people use this method, so I'm going to use it too. You say, like, this is the right way to answer the question. And that's how the job market works. People ask you that because in these fields, there are people who are qualitative. They don't really care about your statistics. They want to understand the intuition of what you've done. And if they can't, they're not going to hire you. And I think that actually holds that science, and weirdly, to like a higher stage of accountability. Yeah.
Okay, there was a question in the back. Yes.
Yeah, Ben Colbert from UT Dallas. Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciated these conversations. You can't hear me? Is that better? Oh, okay. So it got me thinking about whether there are examples about how these sort of behaviors move through a population in the context where the influencer has a real strong negative consequence to change. Because, we're talking potentially about, established faculty that, have been doing science perhaps wrong for years and years and years, right? And all of a sudden, if they sort of adopt this new change and they go back and none of their studies were blinded over the last 20 years, there's potential real consequences and resistance to that change. So I just wondered if there's other examples in, your world where the influencer has sort of that negative consequence that we could use as sort of a model.
I think it's absolutely true. And I think that is actually the state of the world, is that anyone who's entrenched at sort of a high status within some sort of scientific model is going to resist it. And there's 2 sort of reasons. One is, look, science and methods evolves, and who at the stage of career wants to admit that they don't quite understand what's happening with AI, right? And they're like, I get ChatGPT, I'm not sure how to use it in research, right? And so the grad students are coming along, they're trying to integrate it, but they're sort of holding steady with the sort of methods they understand. And you see that with reviewers too. The second one is, are people willing to ask new questions that their research tradition up till now had been unable to ask? And that's where the sort of originality question interacts with the rigor question, which is it the mode of science that we're doing the quote unquote like Kuhnian normal science of just executing a paradigm, or is it that like we're trying to push these paradigmatic questions? And I think in that mode, I think that I do think that smaller labs with a flatter model are actually better for thinking through these sort of paradigm shifting questions. And I think that does have implications for rigor, in the sense that the question is always, is this the right method? Versus saying, we've got a set of tools we know how to use and let's just execute on a set of problems. And I do think that when you have like these entrenched models that are top down, that are reproducible, right? Because they're fundable. And so it's not just these organizations, it's the universities themselves. They're like, we like that model, it generates lots of grant revenue. The question is, all right, well, how do you introduce those models? Some kind of internal pressure to say, we want you to think carefully about whether the thing you're doing and reproducing and getting funded is actually the right way of answering this question, because we're interested not just in the next 5 years, but in the next 100 years, right?
So one moment, just because I wanted to ask this to both of you, which is that, we're thinking, we can't change all the incentive structures, right, that we have in academia. We can try to incentivize the adoption of the content created by this initiative. But what I'm curious about, this goes back to the first question, are there ways to, like, let's say we wanted to engineer a dissemination plan, and are there ways to like quantify how well we're doing in terms of the accessibility and dissemination, how well we're doing in terms of adoption of the materials before we see because the invisible knowledge that we're getting out there, the readouts are all proxies, right? As, like you were talking about. But are there ways to empirically assess how well you're doing at getting more red dots going around, or is it kind of like always post hoc? like during the dissemination process.
So you have
But what do
yeah,
you
you
measure?
could do a randomized controlled trial if you wanted. Yeah.
I wanted to get back at age that you just mentioned before, because I think it's quite interesting. Like our theory of change is a little bit that by the time, for exactly those incentive reasons, by the time someone is old enough and has screwed up science often enough and isn't self-critical enough, which is probably most senior, very famous people, it will be very hard to change their heart. It's like the 10 plagues have happened already. So our model of change is rather that like we can turn the younger folks. And there you think, even if we talk about a hierarchical lab, they're all talking with one another. No, even if the professor isn't convinced, the students produce a norm for one another. And like in the end, they win against the professors. That at least in a way, our theory of change there. How do you think about like that age issue?
Well, so Max Planck has the famous quote, right? It's like the paradigm shifts happen when the older generation of scientists die off, right? This is like the cynical version of how this works. I do think that a lot of scientists, and actually I've been impressed, actually in my own field, that one of the papers I wrote was a huge critique of someone who's a very, very famous sociologist. And then he wrote an endorsement of it, like on the book, which like there are people at that stage who actually are genuinely interested in the ideas versus the sort of ego investment of like, this is my idea, this is your idea. So I think there is that sort of movement that's possible and generationally. But I think it's interesting to think about what the incentives are in the university structure to create a change that's novel. I mean, is it the same thing replicating a model that generates work that we think is good work versus saying, what are the sort of big ideas that can emerge when we sort of start collaborating between these labs? Even though that means we're going to lose some ground in terms of like the things we know how to do, what would that collaboration produce? And it's risk, right? And it's like at a certain stage of career, risk is sort of less attractive. Early on, a risk is hugely attractive, right? You want to do something big and high risk, high reward. And so there would need to be some incentive to like motivate risk at that level with the university.
5 minutes.
It might be the last one or one more after. Yeah.
So my question is a little bit about some of these social and structural interventions. In particular, the ones that were colored at the bottom of the list. I'm curious if you can elaborate on some of the details of what maybe that looks like in your domain and examples perhaps across other domains. Like it's really like the access, the example is the Affordable Care Act, but like are there examples, like what does access look like for us?
It looks like, pre-registration sites, websites, and, estimate power easily, statistical power, things of that type. Primarily access to those in the lab, help to implement those things, but possibly also help to just do things well so people don't have to cut corners and publish their, bad data they got. That would be for access. The social support is another that's very much down there, and it would be instrumental, emotional, informational help to implement whatever behaviors you want. So it could be something like maybe even a hotline or visiting hours within this program, more than just information.
So that's like right that or
Rigor hotline. Yes, Shai.
Thank you both. This was fascinating, and second time I'm hearing Damon. So the one thing that wasn't discussed is time. So these dots move around, but there's no element of time in the model, at least the way it's presented. And I bring this up in relation to what Conrad asked initially: what's better, the lab version or the formal course? And then the element of time comes in, because if you think that this might take 10, 15, 20 years to actually induce change, maybe what you need to target is the young generation or taking the course and you change their behavior, and over time that will lead to the massive change that we want. So that's kind of a question for you. And just as a comment, we just held a workshop a couple months ago on publication bias, on the fact that null results aren't shared, and knowledge is lost because the fact that it's a null result doesn't mean that it's wasn't done carefully. So that's just a point I wanted to mention.
If I can come into that last point first, I think the no results question is really interesting, and I think it's talked about in a lot of different ways. I guess, and this is in the context maybe of pre-registration, that my concern with the conversation around no results is that if a scientific project or a research program isn't well theoretically motivated, it's hard to know what a no result means, right? And so this is kind of my concern with pre-registration as well. It says, look, within this context, we've just, here are a set of hypotheses. But, okay, so when are those hypotheses supposed to fail? When are they supposed to work? What are the boundary conditions of your theory? And why is this the right empirical domain in which to find them? If you can answer those questions, then a no result is meaningful, because you basically said, based on the current theory, our understanding of the universe, we should find results here, right? So if we don't find results here, it means there's a flaw in the theory. And then that means we actually have to revise our theoretical model. And that's the announcement isn't that we got a no result. The announcement is that we did this study so carefully, with so much thought, and based really in a very rigorous understanding of this theory, that the no result is a result. It's that the theory doesn't apply where it's supposed to apply. So there are boundary conditions, or the sort of shape of the space is multidimensional way we don't understand. But that is the result.
Have theories.
Yeah, so I think that that's more general. That happens a lot in science. I think that there are strong intuitions and there are sort of basic reference points and citations. But I think the idea of being able to specify the boundary conditions for a study is something that's rarely done. And so that's something I would emphasize in the context of no results, because in sort of the space of what I just broadly conceived computational social science, there's a lot of sort of data mining. And it's partly because no one knows what the right relevant theory is. They're just saying there's a ton of data, let's back out of this a theory. And the danger of doing that is that if you can't figure out what theory you're supposed to test, you back out some correlations and say, let's rely on common sense intuition, right? This is probably what this correlation means. And I would say it's probably a wrong-headed way of doing science, that I believe in theory-driven work. And the reason I believe in it is because every result is then meaningful, right? When you design experiments and you say, I'm testing this against this, this is the result I predict. And if I don't get it, my theory's wrong, right? I've learned something. And whether that's published or not actually doesn't matter to me as much as the fact that I've actually learned something, right? It means I have to revise the theory. And so I would sort of orient around that as a mode of doing science. And I think that actually, in some sense, mitigates or reduces the value of pre-registration, because the issue there is just a proper model of iterating through ideas and getting to a point. And we would, for like every paper we've published, we found results that say, okay, the theory was wrong here, and it was wrong here, and it's wrong here. So what are the right boundary conditions? And then once we figure out what the boundary conditions are, we get these predictions, and we say, okay, we build it, and then like the results come out just in the way we predicted. And what's interesting is that doesn't mean you're done, because then you can say, okay, the theory would also predict this other result. So we got the first result, but it didn't actually produce the second result. So it means we were like halfway there, but now we have to revise the theory again. That iterative story of like within the lab, that story, that narrative, but like there are very few, except for books, there are very few formats for like articulating that. And I think that's actually kind of the architecture that grad students need to see, is like how those iterations go.
The other part of, yes, time. 3 weeks. They
temporality?
overthrew Mubarak in 3 weeks. So that's the time.
Yeah, that time, right. So temporality is interesting, right? So some of these diffusion processes, like the support for marriage equality, that was like, what was interesting about that one is it spread to like 2.7 million people across Facebook in 1 week, right? And what's nice about that result is like, that sounds viral, but actually turns out to be a complex contagion. The data are very nice on that. Other diffusion processes like Black Lives Matter, it's over years that you see these architectures changing. And so when I think of timescales, I always think of the rate at which structure changes compared to the rate at which dynamics are happening on those structures. So how are bridges being built? How are networks being formed? Usually that's a very slow timescale. That's over years. Then a movement spreading across those networks can happen within weeks. And so I tend to sort of say, all right, let's look at the time scale of network evolution. That's one thing. The time scale of diffusion, that's another thing. And then we can compare them. And for the process of diffusion, we can, for all intents and purposes, consider that a static network. So over 3 weeks, the network isn't changing very much. But over the years, we can see how that could alter the sort of diffusion we might see 2 years later. So, I mean, does that help your question of time scale, or are you looking for something else?
But I think the 12% idea of the networks and establish the bridge and not to expect change to happen like before the.
So I think we're gonna have to wrap up.
Speaking of time,
but
wait, Dolores.
Oh,
No,
sorry.
yeah, I think it's a little bit more complicated than disseminating just an attitude, which is what's happening in those experiments, because it's a tremendous number of skills and knowledge that's not just spreading through a network. Yeah, it's done, over time with a lot of effort.
Well, I think your work, Dolores, is gonna this is a bigger challenge for us than just dissemination. We need to think about exactly how we're going to be able to incentivize the behavior changes, or at least remove some of the other disincentives.
Some of them are incentivized, but I really want to emphasize this notion of coordination. When labs have to work with other labs, and the Human Genome Project is a good example of this, but so is Silicon Valley, honestly. When organizations are forced to work with other organizations just by, whatever it is, environmental pressure, whatever the ecology they're in is, that coordination process drives changes in practices, right? Norms of knowledge creation. And this is the Human Genome Project so interesting, because it's like what was counted as a discovery or knowledge was different in different labs, right? So sometimes the methods they were using was the actual sense of like, what's the valid output? And so having to figure that out, like logistically, but also just the mechanics of like, what does good work look like, is something that actually really changes once we start to coordinate these sort of wide bridges across research groups. So I think of that institutionally as the kind of thing that we'd want to advocate for.
Well, you've both given us a lot to think about, so thank you so much for your time.
For moderating. Please meet me, those of you who are doing the old city walking tour, meet me at the entrance of the hotel at 4:45. 10 minutes.
And then dinner is at 7, I believe, in Old Bar, OLDE Bar, 125 Walnut Street. You also have in your agenda.
Is it actually, or is it like a restaurant?
It's cooked. It's food and alcohol.
It's proper.
Yeah, proper food. There's like a slider bar and sauce. It's like gonna be real.
So I was debating blowing it off and going up.
Not bad. Well, for me, yeah. Six on it now. So I see like what for or gymnastic process. Right. Should have done like or kind of like